Welcome to the Reporters Roundtable. My name is Kathy Obradovich. I am the editor-in-chief of Iowa Capital Dispatch. Have worked in Iowa media for about 30 years, covering government and politics. Last 16 years was at the Des Moines Register, where I was, first of all, a politics editor, then politics columnist, and then opinion editor, and I've also covered the State House for the Lee Enterprises papers in Iowa, which are in Davenport, Mason City, Muscatine, Waterloo, and Sioux City. So a long history of covering the news here in Iowa. And I'd like to introduce our guests here. Pat Reinhardt is the founder and managing editor of Iowa Starting Line. People will see that on the web as iowastartingline.com. If you have any interest in Iowa politics, especially the Iowa caucuses, you should definitely check out Pat's site. He worked for a decade in Democratic campaign politics, launched Iowa Starting Line in 2015, and he manages the team and assigns the stories. They're headquartered in Des Moines, raised in Jefferson City, Missouri, and he has been in Iowa since 2003, moved here to attend Drake and got involved in the Iowa caucuses. And as Erin Brockovich said, she's not Julia Roberts. You may see that this is not Carolyn Cummings. We had a slight change in the program. Carolyn could not make it today, but we're really happy to have Dustin Hoffman here. He is the supervising editor and farm broadcaster for the Iowa Agribusiness Radio Network in Des Moines. So you may not recognize him in person, but a lot of you have probably heard him on the radio. He grew up in a row crop and hog farm in southwestern Minnesota. So I guess I'm the only born and bred Iowan on the stage today. But he's been a broadcaster connected to rural issues for over a decade. So gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. We're going to talk today a little bit about how the Iowa caucuses are dealing with rural issues and farm issues. And Dustin is going to give us a little bit of a report from the ground. He is really connected to the voice of farmers in Iowa. So Pat, starting with you, how would you rate the priority that presidential candidates are giving to rural issues?
I mean, rating compared to others, the issues that you hear out on the caucus campaign trail are what you see in most polling, which is kind of your bread and butter issues of healthcare first and foremost, the economy, jobs. In the Democratic campaign, climate change is obviously one of the top issues. The candidates, though, have been doing a rather good job of addressing rural topics throughout this campaign. Many of them rolled out rather extensive rural policy priority plans early on in the race. A lot have been talking about the SREs and everything that's going on with the ethanol situation throughout this year. Amy Klobuchar in particular, since she's been on the Ag Committee. One of the most interesting things this year is how the issue of carbon sequestration and how Democrats have been talking a lot throughout this year about bringing farmers into kind of the climate solution has been, I think, one of the most interesting things that's come out of this race, where a lot of Democratic candidates went out to a lot of rural counties, spoke with a lot of farmers, and started to develop this, heard about this idea a lot, and then it got included in all their plans and mentioned on the debate stage several times.
And just to elaborate on that a little bit, you mentioned Amy Klobuchar, but are there candidates who are spending more time talking about rural issues than others at this stage?
Sure, I'd say that Tom Steyer, interestingly enough, has been focused on a little bit more. Bernie Sanders, early on in the race, did a lot of like antitrust stuff early on in like spring and summer as he was going around in rural counties. It's not as much lately, I wouldn't say. Pete Buttigieg, who sees himself as one of those types of candidates who could appeal to a broader cross-section of voters in the general election, has been spending a lot more time in these last 2 months in rural counties and has been hitting that up a little bit more.
Okay, and Dustin, you just heard Pat talk about a little bit what candidates are saying on the campaign trail about rural issues. How does that match up with what the major issues are that you're hearing from farmers in particular?
You know, it has to be, first of all and foremost, and we learned this in the last presidential election, it's the rural people want to feel like they've been heard, you know, and making sure that these people aren't coming just to the big cities when it comes time for votes. They're not just coming around for votes. You know, these are the issues, especially when you talk carbon sequestration. You know, there's a lot of farmers, in my family included, that, you know, they want to do right by the land, the water, the air, because that's what they're going to be passing on. That's the legacy of the farm. And they want to make sure they're doing right and protecting the environment. But the thing is, it's how do we do it? How much is this going to cost? You're talking about taking acres out of production. You know, if you're putting in like a buffer strip, for example, I came from Minnesota, that was an issue there. What's going to happen when I'm losing acres when I already have margins that are tight and now I'm taking land out of acres? How do I afford this and how do we make this work so it can go forward, but yet I don't lose the farm over it?
Well, what do you think farmers in particular, but also rural Iowans, want to be hearing from the presidential candidates that they may not be hearing at this stage?
I think the fact that they are listening to them, or that they're getting the information that the farmers are getting, that they're actually coming and talking to them, because of the fact that, you know, when you have people dictating to you how you're going to live your life, and they may not have any idea how farming works, or they never grew up on a farm, they want to. I think it's more of a see than a hear. They want to see them there, coming to their rural communities and engaging with the rural leaders, whether it's in Des Moines here, talking with the Secretary of Ag, or talking to the groups like the IRFA, you know, talking to them, engaging and learning about them as they develop these policies, because policies all sound good and it fits good with buzzwords like the environment and carbon sequestration and a whole host of them that we could go on and on about. But it's the fact that, are you taking the time to learn from these people who are living it every single day? I think it's more of a see than a hear is what they want.
So, Pat, which candidates are actually showing up in rural Iowa at this stage?
So here kind of for the last month, Buttigieg in particular, and in part because he doesn't have a job now, so he can spend all of his time on the campaign trail as much as he wants. Amy Klobuchar just wrapped up her 99 county tour. I was with her for part of the last part, so obviously she has been reaching out to all of them. We've been noticing in kind of these last few months, Elizabeth Warren has been sticking more to the Lynn, Johnson, Polk County, Sanders to a certain extent as well. And part of that is just because when you're running out of time, you typically hit up the places that have the most delegates on caucus night. It's been
the most media.
Yeah, and that. And I think it has been encouraging to a lot of folks, the number of ethanol plant tours that all these candidates took early on to make sure, or almost all the candidates took early on to make sure that they were really well versed on this issue. And one thing, I don't know if it'll come up in our question, so I just want to mention it right here. I think one of the absolute best things that turned out for the agriculture industry, especially for the ethanol industry during this caucus cycle, is that in past caucus cycles, on the Democratic side anyway, you have had different environmental groups that tried to make a big push in the caucus among presidential candidates against renewable fuels. You've also had, just in these last couple years, a lot of national kind of far left voices try and push the idea that, oh, Democrats shouldn't try to go back and win over rural voters because they voted for Trump one time, which is a terribly dumb idea, but that is out there, especially on more kind of online areas. Neither of those trends or storylines really took hold during this caucus, and I think that was on the Democratic side, partially on the ethanol side, because this time around it was an easy way for Democrats to criticize Trump in the White House, and then on the climate side of things, because we had a lot of farmers who put forth this carbon sequestration idea, so that a lot of them were able to grab onto that and give talking points of like bring farmers into part of the solution. That I think is a very underappreciated thing of how well this Democratic caucus cycle turned out for the ethanol industry and for rural Iowa topics. It could have been much different.
So before we move on to Dustin on this, I just want to point out my former employer, the Des Moines Register, has an excellent candidate tracker on its website. And if you really want to know where candidates have been in Iowa you can find out on that tracker. And I totally agree with Pat about what he said about what candidates have been getting out in rural Iowa. But if you go down the pack, a candidate who's still in the race, John Delaney, who has been in the race longer than anyone, if you look at his map, he's actually been in more counties in Iowa than anybody else. So at least they're seeing one guy out there. Dustin, let's talk a little bit about ethanol. What do you hear from farmers at this stage about the effects of the EPA positions, and I'll say positions because they've been in a variety of different places on the renewable fuel standard, and what has been the effect, do you think, on the farm economy? Is it going to get better with the latest status quo from Washington?
Right now we're talking about, it goes back to what Monty said during his remarks, show me you're going to do something about it. You look at a lot of these ethanol plants, biofuels plants around the state that are shuttering or are stepping back on their production by quite a bit. A lot of these farmers, that they go there to sell their corn, or they go there to sell their beans, depending on the fuel. They get a better price sometimes from the ethanol plants, or they could go there to get their dry distillers grains for feeding for animal feed. All of a sudden you have that plant shut down, that becomes a big problem. For them. They now have to find a different market. They have to find a different market for purchasing their feeds as well. Also, you have the fact that some of these people have family members that work off the farm, maybe at these plants, or they have, people who are invested in these plants. Now, as you start to see that investment go down because they're not producing, or you have that maybe a spouse that's out of work right now at one of these plants because they're not running, it also has an effect on the rural economy in the city as well. Your lumber yards are feeling it, your car dealerships are feeling it, because it all becomes a cyclical thing, especially when you're living in a small rural community.
Pat, this is one situation where the administration's policies are directly affecting people on the ground. Do you hear candidates talking about that, the renewable fuel standard in particular, but also the oil waivers that the administration has granted? Yeah,
and again, the candidates learned up on early on in the cycle have been able to speak decently, fluently about it, and it's always something interesting because a lot of national reporters will come in and ask, like, okay, is this ethanol controversy, is that something that's really moving a lot of voters? And my general sense out of events is that outside of people who are directly in the industry, yes, it's impacting the towns, but most Democratic caucus goers, it's still healthcare and climate and jobs factor into it. So, but what the other big thing that is top of mind for all Democratic caucus goers this year is electability. And all the Democrats in this state know that if you get blown out in rural areas and rural counties in this state like they have been lately, then it's a much less likely chance that you can win back a lot of these Midwestern states to defeat Trump in the general. So in a roundabout way, they have been talking a lot and much more fluently about the ethanol situation in these rural counties, if nothing else, to try and prove to the Democrats living there that, like, see, look, I can speak your issues, so I'm not going to get blown out by Trump in a place like this.
Well, you may remember that in 2016, the ethanol issue, especially on the Republican side for the caucuses, was so contentious that it actually caused rifts among some of the well-known Republican office goers who supported different candidates, some of whom were less supportive of ethanol. Is the ethanol issue, maybe because we only have one party, that's active in the caucuses, but do you see that ethanol issue as having as high a profile as it did 4 years ago? Pat, I'm asking you first.
It has. I think it has in certain ways, just because it's been constantly in the news. Everything that's been going on with the waivers. We did not have a lot of conflict between the candidates, which again is something that could have happened. You're not going to see different candidates, Democratic candidates, taking the side of the oil companies in the waiver dispute. But there are definitely environmental groups out there that might have, but did not engage in this as much as they could, and you ended up having Democratic candidates who I think some ethanol advocates were a little concerned about early on, all end up being largely on the same page here.
Yeah, and we did hear, how many of you guys watched the Democratic debate this week? few hands. It was here in Des Moines, by the way. And Amy Klobuchar was one candidate who did mention having visited an ethanol plant or biodiesel plant in Crawfordsville that was shuttered, and talked about the emotional impact on the workers there. So it does come up in conversation, even though a lot of the really loud conversation you hear is about things like healthcare. Yeah. But Dustin, new news this week with the signing of the Phase 1 China deal. Trade has continued to be a major issue here in Iowa. Do you think this change will be enough to allow farmers to make up for the losses of the past year and a half of the trade war?
Well, it's all going to depend, when you're talking especially about grains. I mean, it's going to come down to how much is getting bought. I mean, how much are they really going to be buying? We hear $40-50 billion worth, but how much of that's going to be soybeans? I mean, you looked as soon as this trade war started, and from the time it started to where we are now, the change in the price of beans. We had double-digit prices in soybeans before the trade war. We're now down into that $8-9, we're in single-digit range. Harder for you to break even, hard for you to make a profit when your crops are down like that. It's going to come down to enforcement. Are they going to be able to hold China to it and say, are you going to buy this grain? Are you going to help it? Because once you drive that demand, you're going to start to see the markets go up. But you also have the supply numbers. That doesn't matter what you have for trade, it's how much you've got on stock right now. If nobody's buying because there's too much in the world market, you're going to be sitting there on a load of beans that's not going to be getting you $12 or $14 a bushel right now because of the fact that the demand is not there. It's going to come down to a lot of factors in there, but obviously getting markets open, getting some trade moving again is a good sign. The markets are always going to react to positive news like that, but then again, you have to remember, and farmers know this, that it's going to react to negative news as well just as quickly. We saw about a week earlier this year, back in about June, where everything started to go up, and if you took advantage of it, you sat pretty well for 2020. If you were just holding on, thinking it would go just a little bit higher, when that Friday came and things started to go back down, those numbers didn't look as attractive by the next week, and people missed the boat and it never came back around.
There was a lot of news about dairy farms in Wisconsin not surviving this trade war. Have Iowa farmers been more resilient, and why?
They've been as resilient as they can be. Dairy has been taking on the chin for 5 years or more before the trade wars even started, and that has to do with Class 7 pricing. It has to do with their milk prices and things like that, and supply and demand again as well. But for the most part, outside of the dairy industry in Iowa, yeah, I think pretty well they've weathered it. They're holding on. They're especially after the year 2019 had. We were sitting here a year ago thinking 2019 cannot be any worse than 2018, and boy did Mother Nature say, watch what I can do. But all things considered, I did the crop tour and we came through Iowa earlier this last summer. Crops in Iowa were surprising. Things in Iowa were a lot better than they could have been. And they're coming through. Yes, there are still some crops in the field. Yes, there are fields that were late planted. It wasn't perfect, but it could have been a whole lot worse. And I think if they can just hang on a little bit longer, hearing from market analysts and people like that, things are starting to maybe take a shift upward, but they've just got to hang on just a little bit longer, hopefully.
And Pat, do you think that the signing of the Phase 1 China deal and assuming that the USMCA, the US-Mexico-China deal gets, or Mexico-Canada, I guess is the word I'm trying to say, if that deal gets ratified, will it change the mood of rural voters heading into the general election, do you think?
I mean, well, it depends on when the actual impacts of that gets felt, I suppose. But if USMCA does get passed, which it looks like it's going to, and we're moving forward on China, I would think that it would not be as big of a topic during the election, just in that, okay, we've kind of resolved this to a certain amount. So if it's not featuring in a whole lot of TV ads, if it's not constantly coming up in different debates, if the different parties aren't constantly sending out press releases on it, then perhaps it'll kind of be seen as obviously with the China trade issue, there's still, even with this, there's still a long ways to go, but at least some of that's getting resolved. It's one of the very few political flashpoints from these past couple of years that actually is moving in a direction where it gets resolved.
All right, and we've got about 30 seconds left, Dustin. I want to give you a chance, first of all, to bring up any issue that you think is on the minds in the farm community that we haven't talked about here?
You know, I would have to say infrastructure is, and that's a broad deal. I mean, you have semi-trucks running on rural roads that have got potholes you could practically park a combine in. I know I exaggerate, but you have bridges that need repair. You need roads that need to be upgraded. You have a need for broadband internet. You have all these rural hospitals, schools. You have all this technology in the cab of the tractor and the combine that is all fine and good, but if you can't connect to it decently, you have schools that can't download their books right away because they're going away from textbooks, but it's taking them 2 hours, or they have to go to McDonald's at 5 in the morning to do their homework. That's a problem, and people want to know, hey, we're still out here. They're sending that message. We're still out here. We need some of these services too because it's affecting us. We can't get as connected as we want to be.
And I bet Governor Reynolds will talk about that when she's here this afternoon. Pat Reinert, last word. Who do you think is going to win the Iowa caucuses?
Yeah, of course you're going to.
Monty told me to ask you that.
Yeah, I know. I usually like to make bold predictions. I'm not averse to it. It's just like it is completely up in the air. I could see any of the top 4 candidates coming in any of the top 4 spots. If you had to press me, Pete Buttigieg is still getting the largest crowds of anybody out at events. I typically like seeing that enthusiasm as we go into caucus night, and I think he's got probably the best chance of getting second choices coming into him, so he might end up winning that state delegate equivalent measure on caucus night.
Pay attention to organization, not polls. So, all right, gentlemen, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for being a great audience, and we'll turn it back over.